Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. In the world of comic book adaptations, the characters that truly stand out are not always the ones with superpowers or the brightest costumes. Some of the most compelling heroes and anti-heroes come from the darker, grittier side of the Marvel universe, where the stakes are personal, and the battles are as much internal as they are physical. Frank Castle, also known as the Punisher, represents this side of heroism. Unlike many of his fellow heroes, Frank Castle does not fight for glory or fame. He fights for revenge. His journey is one that is rooted in deep tragedy, and his mission is clear: punish those who have wronged him and his family. To fully understand what makes Frank Castle such a force to be reckoned with, we need to dive into his backstory, the emotional depth of his character, and why his portrayal by Jon Bernthal has become one of the most memorable interpretations of the Punisher. Frank Castle is a man who has suffered immense loss. His wife and children were murdered in cold blood, and the system failed to bring those responsible to justice. This loss transformed Frank Castle from an ordinary man into an unstoppable force, one driven by anger, grief, and a desire for retribution. His method of dealing with the world around him is not through hope or redemption, but through sheer force and violence. He is a man of action, not words. His actions are guided by a brutal code, a code that leaves no room for compromise. When we look at the portrayal of Frank Castle in the Marvel Universe, it's clear that Frank is not your typical hero. He is not the type of character who seeks to inspire others or to be seen as a symbol of hope. In fact, Frank's actions and demeanor often go against the very ideals that most superheroes fight for. While other heroes, like Daredevil, Captain America, and Spider-Man, may be driven by a sense of duty or the hope of making the world a better place, Frank is driven by vengeance. He doesn't fight for justice in the traditional sense. He fights to punish those he believes deserve it. His world is one where there are no gray areas, no moral ambiguity, only black and white. And in his mind, the people who have wronged him and his family deserve nothing but pain. But despite the brutal nature of Frank Castle's mission, there's a human side to the character that has made him so compelling. His tragic backstory is what sets him apart from many other vigilantes. Frank Castle is not a person who was born into violence. He was a man who had everything taken from him. He was a loving husband and father, and he had a life that was full of promise. However, the tragic loss of his family transformed him. The grief and anger that followed turned him into the Punisher. What sets Frank apart from other vigilantes is that his journey is not one of redemption, but one of survival. He is not interested in saving the world or righting wrongs on a grand scale. He is only interested in punishing those who have wronged him, and in doing so, he becomes a terrifying figure in the world of Marvel's street-level heroes. It is this complexity that made Jon Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle so unforgettable. When Bernthal was first cast as the Punisher, many fans were skeptical. After all, Frank Castle is a character who has been portrayed by other actors before, and each interpretation brought something different to the role. From the 1989 film, The Punisher with Dolph Lundgren, to the 2004 version with Thomas Jane and the 2008 iteration played by Ray Stevenson, Frank Castle had been portrayed in different ways. But it wasn't until Jon Bernthal stepped into the role in 2016 that Frank Castle truly became the character we know today. Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle was raw, intense, and emotionally charged in a way that no other version of the Punisher had been before. He didn't just play Frank Castle as a man seeking revenge. He played a man who had been broken by his past, and who was desperately trying to hold on to whatever humanity he had left. Bernthal's version of Frank Castle was not just about the violence or the action. It was about the pain that drove Frank to become the Punisher. In the Netflix series, Marvel's Daredevil Season 2, Bernthal's Punisher was introduced as a character who was driven by grief and loss. His motivation for punishing criminals wasn't rooted in a sense of justice or a desire to make the world a better place. It was born from the loss of his wife and children. Every action he took was fueled by that loss, and Bernthal brought a sense of vulnerability and humanity to the character that made him so compelling. The physical brutality of Frank Castle was only one aspect of the character. What made him so fearsome was the emotional weight he carried with him. Frank Castle was not just a man with a gun. He was a man who had lost everything and was fighting to cope with the devastation that came with that loss. Jon Bernthal's performance was not only powerful because of the emotional depth he brought to Frank Castle, but also because of the physicality and raw energy he injected into the role. His portrayal of the Punisher was unflinching. He didn't shy away from the brutal violence that Frank Castle was known for. But what made Bernthal's performance stand out was how he balanced that violence with the emotional turmoil that his character was going through. Bernthal's Frank Castle was a man who was constantly at war with himself, struggling to retain his humanity while also embracing the darker, more violent aspects of his personality. It was this internal conflict that made Bernthal's Punisher so compelling and so much more than just another vigilante. In the world of superheroes, it's easy for characters to become one-dimensional. They are often defined by their powers, their costumes, or their catchphrases. But Frank Castle was different. He was a man who had lost everything, and it was that loss that defined him. He wasn't a hero trying to save the world. He was a man trying to find peace in a world that had taken everything from him. And it was this complexity that made Bernthal's Punisher stand out from the other superhero portrayals we had seen in the past. When Ben Affleck, who had played another street-level hero, Daredevil, was asked about Jon Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle, his response was both surprising and telling. Ben Affleck, who had battled some of the most powerful beings in the DC universe as Batman, admitted that he wouldn't want to tangle with Bernthal's Punisher. This statement wasn't just about the physicality of the character, it was about the emotional and psychological complexity that Bernthal brought to the role. Frank Castle wasn't just a man with a gun, he was a man who had been broken by tragedy, and who had found a way to use that pain as fuel for his mission. Affleck, who had portrayed Batman as a dark, brooding hero, recognized that Frank Castle was a different kind of force. He was a force of rage, driven by pain and loss, and that made him unpredictable and dangerous. In the world of superheroes, where characters often adhere to a moral code, Frank Castle was a wild card, a man who had no moral compass except for his desire for vengeance. Affleck's comment about not wanting to face off against Jon Bernthal's Punisher speaks volumes about how effective Bernthal's portrayal was. Affleck, a veteran of superhero films, had faced off against some of the toughest opponents in the comic book world, including Superman. But when it came to Frank Castle, Affleck recognized that the character was something different. Frank Castle wasn't just a man with a mission, he was a man who had nothing left to lose, and it was that lack of fear, that willingness to sacrifice everything for his cause, that made him so formidable. In the world of comic book adaptations, it's rare for an actor to leave such a lasting impact on a character. But Jon Bernthal did just that with his portrayal of Frank Castle. His Punisher was more than just a violent vigilante. He was a broken man trying to find peace in a world that had taken everything from him. And it was that complexity, that raw emotion, that made Bernthal's Punisher so unforgettable. Ben Affleck, in his own way, recognized this. By saying that he wouldn't tangle with Bernthal's Punisher, Affleck acknowledged that Frank Castle was a different kind of force, one that was driven by pain, rage, and the need for retribution. Jon Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle will go down as one of the most iconic interpretations of the character, not just because of the violence and action, but because of the emotional depth and complexity that Bernthal brought to the role. His Frank Castle was a man who had been broken by tragedy, and it was that tragedy that made him so fearsome. For Ben Affleck, a man who had played not one, but two iconic superheroes, to recognize the strength of Bernthal's performance speaks volumes about the impact Jon Bernthal had on the superhero genre. Bernthal's Punisher wasn't just another vigilante. He was a man with a mission, and that mission was driven by a deep, unrelenting pain that made him unstoppable. John Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle was unlike anything we had seen before in the world of superheroes. It wasn't the flashy gadgets or epic, over-the-top villainous speeches that made him stand out. Instead, it was the heartbreaking simplicity of a man who had lost everything, consumed by an unrelenting thirst for vengeance. Frank Castle wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a man who had been broken by the world. And the pain of that loss was evident in every line, every motion, and every decision he made. What John Bernthal delivered was not merely a performance. It was a transformation. The character of Frank Castle became so ingrained in him that it felt like John Bernthal didn't just play Frank Castle. He became Frank Castle. The Punisher was no longer just a figure in a comic book or a role to be performed on screen. It was something deeply personal for Bernthal, and this dedication was felt by anyone who watched him. The physicality of Frank Castle was intense. His presence exuded a raw, brutal force that could take on the toughest adversaries, but it was his emotional depth that left an indelible impact. Bernthal's Frank Castle wasn't a perfect hero who followed a moral code. He was a broken man, fueled by rage, whose pain had transformed him into something more terrifying than any superpowered villain. Bernthal's approach to the role wasn't about looking heroic or becoming larger than life. He trained with real-life Marines, studied military tactics, and spoke with veterans to fully understand the psychological toll of war. He didn't want to portray Frank Castle as just a man with a gun. He wanted to portray him as someone who had suffered, someone who had lost everything, and someone who was now left with nothing but vengeance to guide him. His mission wasn't one of hope or redemption. It was one of cold, calculated justice. And for Frank Castle, justice was brutal and unforgiving. This dedication and attention to detail in Bernthal's performance were evident not just in his physical transformation, but in the way he portrayed Frank's emotional state. Frank Castle wasn't just an anti-hero with a thirst for blood. He was a deeply emotional character who, despite his anger, was still grappling with his past trauma. His rage wasn't born out of a desire for power. It was born out of grief, loss, and a thirst to avenge the people he loved. Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle allowed the audience to see this emotional turmoil. In each scene, there was an underlying vulnerability that made Frank feel like more than just a force of nature. He was a man who had been pushed to the edge and was fighting not only against the criminals he sought to punish, but also against his own demons. One of the key aspects of Frank Castle's character is his lack of idealism, and that's where Bernthal's performance shone brightly. Many superheroes, such as Daredevil or Batman, are driven by some form of moral code or a desire to protect the innocent. Frank Castle, however, had been stripped of these ideals. His family was taken from him, and with that loss, his capacity for mercy was shattered. What Bernthal brought to the role was a man who didn't have the luxury of seeking redemption. His sole mission was to punish those responsible for his suffering. His justice wasn't kind, it wasn't noble. It was a devastatingly calculated force that would stop at nothing to see those who wronged him pay the ultimate price. But even with this unrelenting pursuit of vengeance, Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle never made the character one-dimensional. He brought a profound emotional depth to the role, especially in the quieter, more introspective moments. It wasn't all just about action and violence. Bernthal showed us a man who was constantly haunted by the ghosts of his past. One of the most striking moments in Marvel's The Punisher is when Frank Castle stands at the grave of his wife, speaking to her as if she were still there. This scene is raw, unfiltered, and heartbreaking. In it, we see the true cost of Frank's mission, not just in the lives of the criminals he has slain, but in the parts of himself he has lost along the way. The contrast between Frank Castle's violent acts and these quiet moments is where Bernthal's portrayal truly excels. The brutality of Frank's violence is always tempered by the emotional weight of the pain that drives it. Every gunshot, every fight, every brutal act of retribution is a reflection of his inner turmoil. Frank Castle may be a man with no mercy, but Bernthal ensures that we never forget the man beneath the rage, a man who is slowly losing himself to the darkness. It's this juxtaposition of violence and vulnerability that makes Bernthal's portrayal so captivating. While Frank Castle is undoubtedly one of the most dangerous men in the Marvel Universe, he's also one of the most human. There's something inherently tragic about Frank, a man who has chosen to be a force of justice, but in doing so, has forfeited his own humanity. As viewers, we understand that Frank's quest for vengeance is not a path of glory, but one that is slowly eroding his soul. When Ben Affleck says, "I wouldn't tangle with John Bernthal's Punisher," it's not just a playful remark. It's a genuine recognition of the emotional and physical weight that Bernthal brought to the role. Affleck, who has portrayed both Daredevil and Batman, understands the challenges of embodying a superhero, and he also understands the unique threat that Frank Castle represents. Affleck himself had the chance to witness Bernthal's intensity firsthand when they starred together in The Accountant. Their characters clashed in a scene, and Affleck later admitted that the punches Bernthal threw weren't just for show. They were real, impactful, and full of weight. Affleck didn't just feel the physical power of the punches. He felt the anger, the frustration, and the pain that were driving them. That's what made Bernthal's Punisher so terrifying. It wasn't just about the action, it was about what drove the action. It's also worth noting that Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle resonated with Affleck, not just because of his physicality, but because of the emotional core that Bernthal brought to the character. Frank Castle isn't a man who seeks forgiveness. He doesn't want to be a hero or a symbol of hope. He's a man who has been broken beyond repair, and his sole purpose is to make the world pay for what it has taken from him. Bernthal's performance captures this loss so powerfully that even a seasoned superhero like Affleck recognizes the sheer weight of it. Frank Castle's world isn't one of idealism or hope. It's one where survival is paramount, and every action is a step toward either redemption or further damnation. This approach to storytelling brought a refreshing shift to superhero narratives, where the focus wasn't just on saving the world, it was on a man's battle to survive, to take control of his fate in a world that had already taken everything from him. John Bernthal's Frank Castle wasn't just another vigilante with a vendetta. He was a man who had been broken by life, and it was that brokenness that made him such a powerful and tragic character. His Punisher was a force of nature, unstoppable in his quest for vengeance, and yet beneath it all, he was a man desperately searching for a way to cope with his profound grief and loss. In the end, when we think about the future of superhero, films and TV shows, the legacy of John Bernthal's portrayal of Frank Castle will undoubtedly continue to shape how these characters are viewed. He didn't just play the Punisher, he became the Punisher. And for actors, fans, and anyone who has seen his performance, Bernthal's Punisher will remain a benchmark for years to come. His Frank Castle wasn't just feared on screen. He was a symbol of how far a man could be pushed before he became something darker than anyone could imagine.